At my dad's funeral, the silence was heavy, the kind that weighs on your chest. We were standing in a massive cathedral in Chicago, surrounded by the elite of the logistics world. But my sister-in-law Samantha wasn't there to mourn. She was there to claim the throne. She snatched the microphone before the priest could even finish the final prayer. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the somber air. She announced that my brother Zachary was officially the new CEO of our $600 million empire. She beamed, looking around the room for applause. And that is when it happened. A sound echoed through the high-end speakers. A loud, distinct, dry chuckle coming directly from the direction of my father's coffin. It wasn't a ghost, it was a recording. But the terror that flashed across my brother's face, that was very, very real. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. To understand why my father was laughing from the grave, you have to go back about 10 minutes. My brother Zachary and his wife Samantha were treating this funeral like it was the Met Gala. They weren't grieving, they were networking. I watched them from the front pew. Zachary was shaking hands with the board members, accepting condolences for a job he hadn't even started yet. Samantha was literally pointing at the stained glass windows and whispering about how they would look in the executive suite. They looked at me like I was part of the upholstery. Zachary leaned over, adjusting a tie that cost more than my rent. He whispered, "Don't worry, Jessica. We'll find a spot for you in the basement. Someone needs to handle the paperwork while the adults run the show." He smirked. He called me a worker bee, a glorified secretary. He thought he was untouchable because he was the firstborn son. He thought the blood in his veins was a credit card with no limit. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg him for respect. I just felt a cold, clinical calm wash over me. I looked across the aisle at Peter. Peter was my dad's chief of staff, a man who had been the backbone of this company for 40 years. He was holding a small remote control in his hand. I gave him a single subtle nod. That was the signal. Peter stood up and walked to the back of the church. He quietly locked the heavy oak doors. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the sudden silence. Then he pointed the remote at the massive projector screen that had been set up behind the altar for the eulogy video. He hit play. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't a montage of happy family memories. It was my father, Adam, sitting at his desk staring straight into the camera lens. He didn't look peaceful. He looked like he was about to fire someone. That is when the chuckle started. It boomed through the church, freezing Zachary and Samantha in place. The premature coronation was over. The audit was about to begin. As the congregation turned their eyes to the massive projection screen, watching the pixelated face of my father settle into a grim expression, my own mind drifted away from the cathedral. It went back to the places where this empire actually lived. Not in boardrooms with mahogany tables, but in freezing rail yards at 3 in the morning. While Zachary was busy networking in Ibiza or building the brand at Formula One races, I was standing in ankle-deep slush in a distribution center outside of Detroit, negotiating with union leaders to keep the supply chain moving. For 10 years, I was the ghost in the machine. I was the invisible hand that fixed the brakes before anyone even knew they were broken. I missed my best friend's wedding because a shipment of medical supplies was stuck in customs in Rotterdam. I spent my 25th birthday in a server room, rebooting the tracking system after a cyber attack. I didn't do it because I loved the stress. I did it because I believed in a transaction that turned out to be a lie. You see, I had convinced myself that competence was a currency. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I made myself indispensable enough, the merit would eventually outweigh the bloodline. I wore my silence like a uniform. In the logistics industry, a woman who speaks up is emotional, but a woman who fixes problems quietly is an asset. So I became the ultimate asset. I audited the fuel costs. I streamlined the shipping routes. I saved the company $12 million in operational waste in a single fiscal year. I told myself this was dignity. I told myself I was paying a debt of gratitude to the family name. I had forged chains for myself, links made of duty and obligation. I thought that by staying in the shadows I was proving my loyalty. I thought my father saw me. I thought he understood that while Zachary was the mascot, I was the engine. But sitting in that pew watching Samantha clutch her pearls, I realized my silence hadn't been a strategy. It had been a permission slip. By not demanding credit, I had given them permission to erase me. I had allowed them to treat my labor as a natural resource, something they could mine without cost. I wasn't their partner. I was their infrastructure. You don't thank the foundation of a house for holding up the walls. You just assume it will be there. And that assumption was their fatal mistake. They thought my silence meant submission. They thought I was quiet because I was weak. They didn't understand that I was quiet because I was keeping score. Every missed holiday, every stolen idea, every time Zachary took credit for a deal I closed, it was all logged. I wasn't just working, I was accumulating equity in a ledger they couldn't see. And now looking at my father's face on that screen, I knew he had been keeping score too. He had watched Zachary treat the company like a personal piggy bank, and he had watched me treat it like a living, breathing thing that needed protection. The invisible chains were about to break, and the sound of them snapping was going to be deafening. To understand why I didn't feel a shred of guilt watching my brother sweat in that church, you have to see what happened 3 days ago. Our father had been dead for less than 4 hours. The coroner had just left the house. But Zachary and Samantha didn't go to the funeral home. They went straight to the corporate headquarters. I was already there, sitting in my father's office with Peter trying to stabilize the stock price and reassure our global partners that the company wasn't going to collapse. We were grieving, but we were working because that is what this job demands. Then the elevator doors opened and the circus arrived. Zachary walked in like he had just conquered a nation. He wasn't wearing black. He was wearing a navy suit that shouted "new money." He didn't ask about the funeral arrangements. He didn't ask about the employees. He walked straight to the massive oak desk my father had built by hand and ran his finger along the edge. "This has to go," he said. "It's too rustic. I want glass. I want chrome. I want something that says visionary." Samantha was right behind him, tapping on her phone. She wasn't calling relatives. She was calling an interior designer. "We need to gut this entire floor," she announced, her voice echoing in the somber quiet. "It smells like old men and diesel fuel. We need a private lounge, a wet bar, and maybe a helipad on the roof. Zachary deserves an entrance." Peter stood up. His face was gray with grief, but he tried to be the voice of reason. He told them we had a liquidity crisis to manage. He told them the drivers were worried about their pensions. Zachary laughed. He actually laughed. He looked at Peter, a man who had taught him how to tie his shoes, and said, "Relax, Peter. You're barely going to be here. We need fresh blood. You're old news. Consider this your notice." Then he turned to me. I was holding a stack of urgent shipping manifests. Zachary plucked them from my hand and tossed them onto the floor. "And you, Jessica," he said with a sneer. "We need a real face for this company. Someone with charisma. You can stay on to handle the filing and the coffee orders. You're good at the boring stuff. You're like a glorified secretary, right? Just keep the lights on while I spend the profits." They spent the next hour talking about liquidating the trucking fleet to buy a villa in Tuscany because remote work is the future. They were talking about dismantling a 50-year legacy to fund a permanent vacation. They were paper kings. They thought the title gave them the power. They didn't understand that power comes from the respect of the people you lead, and in 60 minutes they had lost every ounce of it. I didn't argue with them. I picked up the papers from the floor. I organized them into a neat pile. I looked at Peter and I saw the fire in his eyes. That was the moment the plan was born. They wanted the title, fine. They could have the title. But they were about to find out that the crown they were stealing was made of lead and it was going to drag them straight to the bottom of the ocean. The video on the screen didn't cut to a montage of fishing trips or birthday parties. It didn't soften into a tearful goodbye. Instead, the image of my father leaned back in his leather chair, crossed his arms, and the camera zoomed in on his eyes. They were hard, flinty, the eyes of a man who had stared down union strikes and supply chain collapses for 40 years. He cleared his throat and the sound reverberated off the cathedral walls like a gavel striking a bench. "Zachary," my father's recorded voice boomed. "You have spent the last 10 years waiting for this moment. You have been waiting for me to die so you could finally stop asking for permission and start spending the principal. You always thought my generosity was a sign of love. You thought that every time I wrote a check for one of your brilliant ideas I was endorsing you." The image on the screen shifted. The video feed shrank to the corner, replaced by a high-resolution image of a massive Excel spreadsheet. The rows were color-coded in red. It was a ledger of sins. "Let's review the portfolio," my father narrated, his voice dry and clinical. "Item 1. The nightclub in Miami. You told me it was a cultural investment. Cost $2,400,000. Status bankrupt in 6 months. Item 2. The vintage car restoration business. Cost $1,800,000. Status liquidated for scrap. Item 3. Your personal branding consultants. Cost $400,000 a year. The congregation was dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Samantha had stopped pointing at the architecture. She was staring at the screen, her mouth slightly open, watching the numbers scroll by. It was a public audit of their entire lifestyle. People told me I was spoiling you, my father continued. They told me I was ruining you by giving you everything you asked for. But they were wrong. I wasn't spoiling you, son. I was testing you. I was running a feasibility study on your character. I gave you unlimited resources to see if you would build something or if you would just burn it down. I wanted to see if the golden child could actually turn lead into gold or if he would just paint everything yellow and call it a day. This was the curse of the golden child revealed in 4K resolution. My father hadn't been blind to Zachary's incompetence. He had been documenting it. He had allowed Zachary to consume his own future because he knew it was the only way to prove empirically that he wasn't fit to lead. He had given Zachary the rope, and Zachary had tied the noose himself. You failed the test, Zachary, my father said, the spreadsheet disappearing, replaced by his face again. You burned it all. But here is the thing you forgot. I'm a businessman. I don't give away capital without paperwork. Do you remember those standard agreements Peter had you sign every time I wired you money? You didn't read them. You were too busy popping champagne, but if you had read them, you would know something very important. My father smiled on the screen, a cold, terrifying expression. Those weren't gifts, Zachary. They were loans. Loans against your inheritance. And according to my math, you have already spent every single dime. The spreadsheet vanished from the screen, replaced by a scanned image of a legal document. It was crisp white and unmistakably official. At the bottom, in blue ink, was a sprawling, arrogant signature, Zachary Vance. My brother leaned forward in the pew, squinting. I saw the moment recognition hit him. His jaw dropped. His hands started to shake. 5 years ago, my father's voice intoned, you needed bail money for that incident in Monaco. You needed it fast and you needed it quiet. You signed this promissory note and equity transfer agreement. You didn't read it because the font was too small and you were too hungover. But let me read the key clause for you. The text on the screen zoomed in, highlighting paragraph 4. In the event that the borrower's total debt to the company exceeds $6 million, the borrower agrees to forfeit all future equity voting rights and inheritance claims in the company. Furthermore, said equity shall immediately transfer to any party who satisfies the outstanding debt on behalf of the company. The silence in the cathedral was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. My father paused on the video, letting the legalese sink in. Last month, he continued, your debt hit $6,200,000. Technically, the company could have sued you. We could have seized your condo, your cars, everything. But someone stepped in. Someone wrote a check to clear the books. Someone used their own performance bonuses, their own savings, and their own sweat equity to pay off your mistakes so the company wouldn't go under. The screen changed one last time. It showed a bank transfer receipt. The amount: $6,200,000. The sender, Jessica Vance. You didn't inherit the company, son, my father said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a shout. You sold it. You sold it piece by piece, drink by drink, mistake by mistake, and your sister bought it. She didn't just inherit this empire, she purchased it at full market value. She owns your shares, she owns your vote, she owns the chair you're sitting in right now. I watched Samantha turn to Zachary. The look on her face wasn't love. It wasn't concern. It was the look of a woman realizing she had bet on a horse that had already been turned into glue. She started to scream at him right there in the church, but her voice was drowned out by my father's final words. Jessica, he said, looking at the camera with a warmth I hadn't seen in years. The keys are in the safe. Fire him. The video cut to black. The hum of the projector fan died down, leaving a silence in that cathedral so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The lights slowly came back up, illuminating the wreckage of my brother's ego. I watched Samantha first. She turned to Zachary slowly. The adoration, the status-seeking hunger in her eyes, it simply evaporated. It was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She realized in that split second that her golden ticket was actually a liability. She realized she hadn't married a CEO. She had married a man with $6 million of debt and 0 assets. She didn't comfort him. She didn't hold his hand. She shoved him. You lied to me, she hissed, her voice cracking the silence. You told me it was done. You told me the money was yours. Zachary ignored her. He scrambled out of the pew and ran toward me. His face was pale, slick with sweat. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life I didn't see arrogance. I saw panic. He tried to grab my hand, but I stepped back. "Jessica," he stammered, his voice trembling. "This is a joke, right? Dad was sick. He wasn't thinking straight. You can't actually do this. We're family. You can't fire family." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I realized something profound. For years I had been intimidated by him and Samantha. They walked with such confidence. They spoke with such authority, but now standing there with his inheritance stripped away, he looked small. He looked like a child wearing a costume he couldn't afford. It occurred to me then that their power had never been real. It was rented. Their entire identity was a subscription service paid for by my father's money, and the subscription had just expired. Without the wallet to prop them up, there was no person left. It was the delusion of power from an empty vessel. I reached into my purse and pulled out a single thick envelope. I didn't yell. I didn't lecture him. I didn't give him the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I simply held it out. "This isn't a joke, Zachary," I said, my voice steady and clear. "This is a termination notice, effective immediately. Peter has already deactivated your keycards and revoked your access to the company accounts." He stared at the envelope like it was a bomb. "And inside," I continued, "is a repayment schedule for the remaining $200,000 you still owe the estate. I expect the first payment on the 1st of the month. Don't be late." He tried to speak, but no words came out. He just stood there, a king without a kingdom, while the board members behind us began to check their watches, ready to get back to work. Walking out of the cathedral felt different than walking in. The air seemed cleaner, the sun seemed brighter. Peter was waiting by the car, the back door already open. For 20 years he had held that door for my father. Today he held it for me. He didn't say a word, but the slight smile on his face said everything. We understood each other. The chaos was over. The order was restored. We drove past the main distribution warehouse on the way back to the office. I looked up at the massive sign, the trucks lining up at the bays, the sheer scale of the operation. For a decade I had looked at this place and felt the crushing weight of duty. Today I felt the grounding weight of ownership. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was mine. I had bought it with sleepless nights and missed holidays, and I had the receipt to prove it. My phone buzzed on the seat beside me. It was a notification that Samantha had filed for divorce. I swiped it away. Then a call from Zachary. I blocked the number. I didn't feel guilty. I felt efficient. I had cut the dead weight from the supply chain. That night I didn't toss and turn. I didn't worry about what Zachary would destroy next. I slept soundly, knowing that the empire was finally safe in the hands of the one person who knew how to carry it. If you believe that leadership is earned, not inherited, hit that like button and share this story. And tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven the debt, or did Zachary get exactly what he deserved?